For more on this story, I want to bring in someone who was actually in the room with President Trump and the Guillén family. Theo Wold is here. He's a former deputy assistant to President Trump. He's a current board member at American Moment, and he joins us on the phone. Theo, good to have you with us, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Vince. It's good to be with you.
It's an amazing story. We were playing some of the audio of the Oval Office meeting that you sat in on in 2020, but tell us the truth. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, from my vantage point, it was an interesting turn of events because I was actually there in the room to help translate for the president. I'm not a translator by vocation. I was a advisor to the president on domestic policy issues. But if you recall, Vince, and your listeners probably remember this, at that time, a number of the president's private conversations with foreign leaders had been leaked, and the assumption in the White House was the leakers were the translators of those conversations, and they had given over sensitive and classified information for public consumption. And so the president really wanted to have this meeting with the Guillén family, and he wanted it to be private. So I got a call from the chief of staff then, Mark Meadows, early that morning and said, Theo, we understand you're a fluent Spanish speaker. Do you mind coming in and helping the president out? And that's how I was there in the room. And what I saw was, number one, an incredibly poised and truly confident American family. The Guilléns are a family that any American can be proud to call them fellow citizens and members of our national community. They raised a daughter who wanted to serve her country in the armed services. And then she has two remarkable sisters who have become essentially advocates for improving the way DOD and the armed services handle issues of sexual violence and violence reporting. But they were there, incredibly poised, and the president was deeply touched by her story, by Army Specialist Vanessa Guillén's story of service, of her family, and really, for me, it came home that this was a commander-in-chief who was concerned about one of his soldiers. He wanted to know what happened, why hasn't DOD and the Army been forthcoming, why hasn't the family received the transparency that they need? And then, the other thing that people kind of memory hold in this entire discussion that's unfolded in the last 24 hours is, and you probably recall this, at that time, there were 25 soldiers who had died at Fort Hood, including by homicide and by suicide. There were 14 soldiers who were fired from the Army or suspended for violence. I mean, really heinous violence at Fort Hood. And then not far from where they found Army Specialist Guillén's remains, they also found later the remains of another missing serviceman, Army Specialist Morales. And so this was happening in the context of, hey, what is going on at Fort Hood? So
Yes.
The interest from President Trump was genuine and heartfelt.
Okay, so in that, let me just play audio so people can get a sense of this. This is that day in 2020, President Trump meeting with Vanessa Guillén's family. You are there helping to translate for, I believe it's her mother primarily, right? And for the President of the United States?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, and here's some of the audio from that meeting.
You mean you haven't had a funeral because this is quite a while now?
Yeah, right.
Because I even saw it quite a while ago.
Correct.
And because you don't have the body yet,
No remains. That's all we're.
but they have the body.
The remains.
Okay.
It's just a disgrace. And how can someone be capable of doing that?
No, it's a terrible thing. When would you like to have the funeral? When?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, I agree. As soon as possible with the funeral. We make sure that happens.
Ya,
Okay,
es que
please?
tienen que entregármela ya.
Thank you.
Ya porque es.
Where
es
will you
su
have the
hermano.
funeral? Do you know?
Houston.
In Houston?
Yeah.
Ya,
All right.
es-
And if I can help you out with the funeral, I'll help you out. I'll help you out financially. I'll help you.
I think the military will be taking care of it.
Good. Those are military. That's good. If you need help, I'll help you out.
Thank you, President.
Okay, if they need something, we'll take care. We'll make sure she is very respected.
Okay, so there's a lot of interesting things going on here. President Trump's empathy is crystal clear in the audio we just heard, and the family seems appreciative. President Trump makes an offer of personally paying for the expenses of the funeral. And I believe that's the family attorney who responds, there's no need for that because the military will be covering the cost of the funeral. Am I following all of that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right. The only thing I'd say is I think the voice that we heard is from Mayra Guillén, who Vanessa Guillén's sister, and I mentioned this on one of the social media posts I made on this whole incident, which was she was incredibly poised. I mean, I don't know many people who walk right into the Oval Office and are able to look the President of the United States in the eye and say, hey, I need your support in passing this legislation, the I Am Vanessa Guillén Act, and we need to do right by my sister. Then bat an eyelash, and that is one of really remarkable features of this family. So I think that's whose voice you heard there.
Yes.
And what's interesting is what preceded this moment that the press was allowed in for. The president asked before, we had about a 23-minute conversation with the family, and at the very end of that, the president turned to Mr. and Mrs. Guillén and said, look, hey, do you want the press to come in or not? Because this is your rodeo, and if you need them to carry this story so we can put more pressure on DOD and the Department of the Army to move quicker on this, that's great. If you want to use this to raise awareness of the I Am Vanessa Guillén Act, great. It's your call, though. And I'm going to tell you, the press, they're always going to spin something, in unpredictable ways. And the family said, yes, it would be helpful if we brought the national press in, because then they can highlight this and we can speak to them and raise awareness of what happened to my sister, our daughter, and raise awareness of what we want to see done as far as changes in the way these kinds of acts of violence are mentioned. So, the Jeff Goldberg account in The Atlantic was, well, the president was trying to grandstand off of the violence done to this young woman and use the family as a prop. Not at all what happened. And as you noted, Vince, you can hear it in the interchange between the president and the family over, covering the cost of the funeral and whether or not it will be a military burial or provided through private means.
So a couple other pieces that follow that event. One of them is that even the Atlantic acknowledges that some of the costs of the funeral were indeed covered by the Army. And in fact, the Army offered to allow Guillén to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Some of the expenses of the funeral were covered by donations from concerned Americans, I guess, who wanted to help. And also, as I understand it, President Trump fought to make sure that she had a line of duty death designation so that her family would be the recipient of all the benefits that come with that designation. Do I have all of that right?
That's exactly right, Vince. Yep.
And so, in other words, so he carried the torch for her beyond that meeting, rather than the way that the Atlantic represents President Trump today is that he was angry at her that her death was expensive. Quote, it doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a bleeping Mexican, yelling at Mark Meadows, don't pay it. Can you believe it? Bleeping people trying to rip me off. None of that makes sense in the context of a funeral that apparently was paid for by the Army, donations, and the efforts by President Trump to get that family the financial assistance they deserved.
Well, it only makes sense, Vince, if you acknowledge that the left is desperate to discredit Donald Trump as commander-in-chief, right? At this hour right now, what they want to do is say the man is unfit to execute the full duties of the office of president, including being commander-in-chief of the armed services. And they've been at this for years, trying to, build this narrative. And what I saw with my own eyes, again, was, as I described it to my wife when I came home from work that day, it's the closest I'll ever come to being in the room with Lincoln. This is, when we hear the stories and we read the letters that Lincoln wrote to the surviving family, the widows, the mothers of deceased soldiers in the Civil War, the account wasn't just of a commander-in-chief. It was of the father of the nation, deeply concerned about the well-being of someone who put their life on the line, who put on the uniform to serve this country. And that's what I saw. I saw the commander-in-chief who wasn't just, this is a family, it's another headline. It was, what happened to my soldier, and why aren't we getting answers? Because enough is enough. How many good soldiers do we need to sacrifice to violence, to suicide, before we have a process to protect our men and women in uniform?
So this Atlantic piece, which we've well established now is a gigantic piece of slander, it also makes allegations that President Trump envies Hitler and that he wants to be a fascist dictator and that he demands loyalty to him and not the Constitution. Theo Wold, you worked with the guy. What do you make of those claims?
Never in a million years. Never in a million years. I mean, look, I think Mercedes Schlapp, who was a colleague of mine in the White House, put this perfectly on X this afternoon. We are pretty certain that most of these anonymous sources for Goldberg are the same anonymous sources he relied on in the Normandy D-Day smear attack on President Trump a few years ago. it's General Kelly and people who were in General Kelly's orbit who are, still trying to belittle the president and demean his legacy and his continued aspiration to serve the country with these silly stories about, he admires the Hitler's generals, but didn't know who Rommel was. Never saw anything to the effect. What I saw instead was that President Trump has a deep and abiding love for the men and women who put on the uniforms. That's why General Kelly was selected to lead DHS, because of President's love and admiration for the men and women of our armed services. That's why General Mattis was selected for DOD, because he genuinely admired men and women, and that love and admiration grew out of his long-standing appreciation for the heroes of World War II, like General MacArthur and General Eisenhower. So the idea that suddenly he becomes this aficionado of Hitler's generals, it's a baseless smear. But worse, as I said earlier, it's really an attempt by the left to discredit the work that President Trump did as commander-in-chief. Because, look, he advocated for the very thing and got it across the finish line that Democrats have been talking about for years, creating reporting structures in the armed services that protect our men and women in uniform. The I Stand with Vanessa Guillén Act was supported by President Trump, and it is now law. And that was done under his efforts, under his leadership. And that steals one of those leading talking points that Democrats have, they've complained about it, they've moaned about it for decades, but did nothing to actually make it a reality. And President Trump did.
And lastly, by way of brief summary, think about the way the Biden-Harris administration has treated the troops, the forced COVID vaccinations, the running out of chaplains who say that they have a religious exemption and they say, I don't care, they do that. To them, the peril in which our service members are placed with each passing day as we get closer to World War III, the 13 fallen service members in Afghanistan who lost their lives during that disastrous exit, and then, of course, what's happening here domestically as they lead an administration that's imprisoning their political opponents, that's threatening to take legal action against people like Elon Musk merely for supporting free speech and voter registration, who's it's just an endless series of tyrannical abuses, and yet they're pointing their finger at Trump and saying that he's the threat to this country, Theo Wold.
Yeah, I think the way I'd put it at the end here, Vince, is just to say, look, the elites want to protect each other. They want to perpetuate a false narrative, and it's the true, hardworking, truly noble common citizens of America, people like Mayra Guillén, who went on social media and said, everything you're saying, Jeff Goldberg, is a lie. I was there. She was my sister. And guess what? Today, I cast my vote for Donald Trump.
Amen. All right. Hey, Theo Wold, thank you. Excellent perspective. Really appreciate you sharing it with us today.